I've just got one question, if that's all right. I guess Canadians are concerned. One of the things they're concerned about is, will the passage of this FTA make things worse in Colombia if our government passes this? And on the flip side of that, would the failure to pass this FTA make things better? Do you want to, I think, do you know what I'm sort of getting at? In other words, is this really going to make a difference on the ground, whether or not this particular FTA passes or fails?
I could jump in for the moment. It's an important question, obviously, and one that should be upmost in our minds, because most of us agree that the human rights situation and the situation of violence in Colombia is dreadful. Where we tend to disagree is who's responsible and if it's improving or not, and whether or not something like an FTA will help to improve that situation. From what we know, there's a couple of things that must be looked at. Number one is that such a free trade agreement will give a seal of approval in some ways from the Canadian government, which is still seen internationally as a human rights defender and promoter, will give that kind of a sense of approval to the Colombian government that the Colombian government is seeking. It is seeking this kind of approval for international, to be able to spread itself around more internationally, both through trade agreements, but also to make its image better. This same image, or this same seal of approval, has been denied time and time again. It has been denied continuously in the United States Congress and in the European Union, where it's being debated right now. There's a great deal of opposition to it as well. Just one last point before I let others join in, and that is, a very great part of a conflict in Colombia is in regards to land. And that involves, in many ways, multinational interests and national interests as well, business interests as well, which is not to say that all multinational companies nor Colombian companies are involved in paramilitary activities. However, it's very hard to work in any area of Colombia without being involved with the paramilitary. We've heard this time and time again, whether it means paying bribes, paying security protection, paying them to help with clear land in one way or another. And that, I think, is something that we as Canadians and as a government would not like to promote through a free trade agreement. So I think there's still too many questions to move into this at the moment. That would be my first take on that one.
I'd like to answer that as well. 2 years ago, when the Trade Committee went down to Colombia, we came back and had a unanimous recommendation that there be no further proceeding with a trade agreement with Canada and Colombia until an independent human rights assessment was done. And that came from all four parties. It was an NDP recommendation, but adopted by all four parties. A few days later, the Conservatives pulled out of that. And then after the Liberal leader changed, the Liberals seemed to be repudiating that position. But the reason why parliamentarians agreed to that unanimously was because they saw on the ground what the situation was in Colombia. And whether we're talking about independent human rights organizations in Colombia or human rights organizations elsewhere, every single one of them has said very clearly that there is a strong risk of this making the situation worse in Colombia. And because of that, the Parliamentary Committee was very clear. Do an independent human rights assessment, and then let's see whether the pretension that somehow this will improve things in Colombia could be verified. And the government hasn't done that, I think, for one very simple reason. They know that any independent assessment of the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement will lead to greater concerns about the fact that it may worsen the human rights situation there. For two reasons. One, the investor state provisions that are an override by very large companies. And given the theft of land, Colombia has the worst human rights record on the entire planet for violent theft of land, forced displacements of millions of people. As a result of that, giving extra protection to multinational companies may mean that some of those companies, some Canadian companies, may be complicit in human rights violations. Secondly, the so-called protections in the Canada-Colombia trade deal, what we've entitled the kill a trade unionist, pay a fine provisions, make a mockery of human rights protections in Colombia. What what measures would go into effect if there's the continued killings of trade unionists, and what we've seen over the last few years is a worsening of that situation. So it's very likely that those killings will continue and tragically may even worsen, is that the net result of that is the Colombian government pays a fine to itself. That's absurd, and it's a complete repudiation of basic Canadian values. So the structure of the agreement itself and the current situation in Colombia lead human rights advocates to say this will quite likely to worsen the situation in Colombia. There is no independent human rights organization anywhere in the world saying this will improve the situation in Colombia. So I think it's extremely important to note that parliamentarians who went down to Colombia came back with that recommendation because they saw what was going on. And we actually heard from human rights advocates and labor activists and environmental activists. That's why there was that unanimous recommendation. And the government simply does not have anybody backing their claim that this will make the human rights situation better in Colombia.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.